George English. I'm the Director of Research Through People. We've made this video for those of you who had ancestors who emigrated from Britain to USA or Canada. And migration's fascinating. I mean, why does someone leave one place and go somewhere else? There's many motivations that may be behind a person leaving one country and going to another. It may be what we call push, things like war, famine, persecution, or other causing them to leave, or pull, the attraction of a brave new world in the case of America, or a new life somewhere different. There have been millions, of course, who over the years have gone from England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales across to America. The Mayflower, of course, it's the 400th anniversary this year of the Mayflower going, and the successful colonisation that followed after that. And what's interesting with research, because of the developments in communication, so we can achieve so much more in finding out than we could in the past. Not only can we research, of course, in England and Scotland and so forth, but we can also research in America and in Canada. And that very often is a useful link, a connection that we make. I personally am particularly passionate about this because I've been to the Americas many times, and I used to work for an American company. And I had an ancestor who was on the Mayflower 400 years ago. So what we're going to do is show you what is involved and use examples to illustrate the sort of things that we may be able to find out on your behalf. First, let's talk about the sort of factors in tracing ancestry, and they're the same as they are in any other case, but there's additional information that we may have in this case. So status, people who were noble or landowners, that tended to get recorded. And those are the three key things. Did your ancestor do something that caused people to record it? Secondly, has it survived to this day? And thirdly, can we find it? But in the case of nobles, landowners very often, but other things, professions, accountancy, doctors and so on and so forth, keep records. Passenger lists have become much more available in recent years, of course very relevant. We can very often trace the ancestors going across from Europe to America. And of course you keep very good records at Ellis Island, the immigrants from the 19th century. Very often we can trace people arriving in New York. And then even at the other end of the scale, the workhouse kept good records. What sort of records? Well, registration started in England in 1837, 1855 in Scotland. That's the registration of births, marriages and deaths. The census is a very key document. Started in 1841, held every 10 years. Only released in the UK 100 years out, whereas in America you release it 75 years out, and that can often be quite a useful addition to our knowledge. Parish registers, before registration it was the church parish registers that we mainly rely on, and then there's all sorts of other things, wills, gravestones, newspapers. I mentioned Ellis Island. The surname, let's have a look. If it's a name like John Smith, much harder to find than if it's a very unusual surname. And it'll be a big factor on how successful we are in narrowing down and finding your ancestor. And continuity. In the old days, 200 or more years ago, people tend to stay in the same place, in the same rural areas. Then as the Industrial Revolution took place, people left and went to the cities and towns for the jobs. And obviously in the case of your ancestors, they emigrated to another country. Can we track them and find them? So let's look at some examples. So here we had a husband and wife. They emigrated, or the family had emigrated to Canada. Both husband and wife had ancestors from Scotland and from England. So there they are in Toronto. They're born around the time of the Second World War. Interesting VE Day on here. If we go back in time, then there's Slade and Fleming. Slade born in Canada, but married Jessie Fleming, who was born in Scotland, in Dundee. On the wife's side, both of her parents were born in Canada. Now, we've left Greta Wedderman. She actually had ancestors from the USA. But in the case of Slades, they came from Bristol in the West Country of England. The Flemings came from Scotland, around Dundee in the east coast of Scotland. And then the Peardons came from the Devon and Cornwall, the very southwest of England, and married Margaret Dempster from Dumfries in the borders of Scotland. And going back in time, we got back to the 18th century around Bristol. four for Dundee and Cornwall. So we've got a very interesting story building up of people from various areas coming together and eventually emigrating. So let's look at the Peardons in Cornwall in the 17th and 19th century. And one of the things we tend to do in our reports is plot where the ancestors lived. And it helps us, build up our understanding of where they lived and the movements, but also it helps to see visually. And here you can see a situation, so people didn't move very far. These are all the places where Peardon family members are found, within a few miles of each other in Cornwall and just over in the border with Devon. So for 200 years staying very much in the same area. And I talked about parish registers. Here's a baptism register from 1752 with William, the son of Samuel Pierdon, and April 19th, 1752. Handwriting here is fairly good. Not always the case with old records, particularly going back in time. Now, so the noble family came from Dundee, one of the main cities in Scotland. Now, here's one of the features of Dundee is the Law Hill in the middle of Dundee. So they actually came over and we showed them round their ancestors' footsteps. So the first thing we did, we went up the top of the Law Hill and looked at the view. Now their family actually came from an area called Lochee on the west side of Dundee. We looked down on that. The River Tay, a very prominent river, flows up to Perth and very much a feature. So we were able to show them at the beginning of the day, here is the perspective of where your ancestors lived. Now, our ancestors lived through history. Now, one of the big events in Dundee in the late 19th century was the Tay Bridge disaster in 1879. They just built the new Tay railway bridge and some of it collapsed. Carriages went into the sea and 75 people were drowned. Now, it didn't affect the noble family, but of course they were living there at that time. They'd have read about it, heard about it, where they were living. And they lived in Lochee. Now, in fact, Dundee is known for three things, the three J's, jute, jam and journalism. Dundee was the centre of the jute industry. The Camperdown jute mills were once the largest in the world. And the noble family worked in the jute mills. And we find the census where 6 children all work in the jute industry along with the father. And they lived very close to where the mills were. Mills are no longer there. Now, another thing I mentioned is poverty in the past. Now, one of the women died when she was in her late 40s. She's left on her own and she's a pauper. That's the expression that was used there. Ended up in the poorhouse. Now, the poorhouse is no longer there, but they keep good records. We actually went to where the poorhouse had been, and you could sense the sort of the tragedy of survival for that person. Now, it led to something where graveyards, it's very interesting, it can be very emotional to go and find the gravestone of an ancestor. So we found where the grave was. The husband was buried in, we went, and it was just like a lawn, green lawn, buried in common ground. Thousands of people just buried without any record at the grave of who was there. Now, the wife had actually bought what's called a lair in Scotland, a burial lair, and here it is. But you can see there's no gravestone. So if you had bought the lair, but no one could afford a gravestone, and it wasn't until her son and his wife with actually a gravestone at another grave. Again, the way our ancestors lived through. So now let's take the Oxtons, another situation. They came from England, from around Liverpool on the west coast. There's Jessie Oxton, born in Hoole, quite near Liverpool, and she emigrated to Connecticut. Emigrated in 1907. And there's her parents living quite near Liverpool, a little bit south of that and towards the border with Wales. Going back in time, again, they're around the same sort of area within sort of 20 or so miles of Liverpool. And we got back to the 18th century, and here we are with the mid-18th century, the Batterby and Tonley in Hanmer and Malpas. Now, one of the interesting things to find out from the census is what sort of jobs did they do. Now, so there we are, we've got William Oxton and John Hinton were both publicans. So William and Sarah married, both of their fathers were publicans. William became a baker. Now, one of the things we were able to do was find the pub which William Oxton had been the publican of. It was still there. and again brings to life what our ancestors lived through. Now, of course, a lot of housing and things from the past has been demolished, but what sort of buildings are there? Well, churches typically there. So the Bebington Parish Church was there. In Malpas, the Cross, there's new and old buildings, but it still has something of the same appearance as some of the old buildings from when they lived there. And then the port of Liverpool, one of the main ports in Britain, brought a lot of wealth to the area. And here's a rather nice old painting. We're showing lots of shipping and the big buildings in Liverpool. Now, those of you who follow football may have heard of Liverpool, one of the most famous clubs actually not just in Britain but in the world. And there's where Liverpool Football Club's ground is, called Anfield. And there's actually two clubs in Liverpool. The other one is called Everton, the Toffees as they're called. You can see the grounds very close to each other, very fierce rivalry. And the Oxtons lived in Redcar Street, very near these buildings. And there we are, we found in the 1911 census an entry for them, and they emigrated in 1912. So again, a story of what happened to someone's ancestors before they went away. So let's take another one, Riddex and Dunlop in USA. So here we have Isabella Dunlop. She's born in America, in Pennsylvania in 1885. Her parents are both born in Scotland, but married in America, and Hugh Dunlop's born in Asia. This seems strange for Scotland, America. What happened? Well, in fact, we found in the 1880 census, here are the McDougalls, and here's Margaret Dunlop, mother-in-law, clearly Grace's mother. Hugh Dunlop, brother-in-law, clearly brother of Grace, and nephew, John Dunlop, the son. So they're born in Scotland. William McDougal's born in England, Grace born in Scotland. Clearly they've gone out to Pennsylvania and their children are born over in America. And so here we have the Dunlops, and here we add on, in fact, Isabella Dunlop, born in America, marries William Riddex, born in Ayrshire, actually marries him in Ayrshire. They went out to America soon after because their daughter Annie is born in Pennsylvania in 1907. Now, I mentioned being able to access American records as well as English ones and Scottish ones, and here we have the actual passenger list for William and Bella Riddex going out from Glasgow to New York in 1907. Very detailed records I had then. They even had sort of things about their complexion and physical appearance. Hard to read the writing, I know, but so we were able to trace them there. We were able to find the birth record for Annie Riddex. Here she is, born in Hamilton, Pennsylvania. Here's the father, living in Morris Run, but born in Ayrshire, and the mother, Isabella, born in Morris Run. And I showed you the census earlier. Now, what was in her passenger list? We were able to find 5 separate voyages made by the Dunlops and Riddexes. There's Dunlop going out in 1879, going out after he'd married in 1906, and then William Riddex and Isabella Dunlop, we saw that record. But we also saw Marion and the family going out in 1909 and 1912. Presumably the husband was out there, but there were something like 6 or 7 children. I don't know what the fares were like at that date, but they had to pay for that out of their own pocket. You would think that would be very expensive, but there we go. So that gives you a flavour of the various sorts of things. I mentioned the Mayflower being the 400th anniversary this year in 2020, and I like this expression, all people are living histories. And I'm sure you Americans know there are, I think, 51 of the passengers who have known descendants, something like 35 million descendants they reckon, and there are excellent books published by the General Society of Mayflower descendants of the first, second, third generations of those people. Well researched, the evidence is good, so I was able to buy a book for Richard Warren, my actual ancestor on the Mayflower, of 5 generations of his descendants. Philip Delano went out the following year, and again there's a book for him. And the reason I'm in Britain rather than America is because in around 1785 Captain Henry Delano came back to England. So that's why America and Canada are very special to me. So I hope you found that interesting. Researcher people, we're very happy to hear from you and see if we can help you. We give a free consultation. We want to make sure we've looked at things for you and come up with options, and we come back to you with options that we suggest, because what's important is that actually you know how much it's going to cost. we know how far to go with our research. We've currently got for Mayflower 400 a 10% introductory discount, so very happy if you get in touch to offer that to you. And we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.